Next month, July 2024, we're writing Senryu together to inspire your creativity and give you a bit of background in the history of Senryu. I'm running a series of podcasts about them. This is the second one. The previous one was episode 23. So if you haven't listened to it, it might make sense to go back and have a listen or a watch, because of course it's on YouTube as well. Now, unfortunately, while I was preparing for this series of podcasts, my dear husband brought a rather nasty cold into the house and kindly shared it with me. I spent more time sleeping off the virus than I would have liked, so this podcast won't be as long as I'd like, but I do have some great Senryu to read to you and recommendations for what we'd like to see in the reading period next month, and a teeny weeny story. Hello, I'm Patricia, and you are most welcome to join me on a journey to Senryu on this, the Poetry Pcast. So, in episode 23, I had a look at Senryu in the pre-modern period. That's before 1868, to be more precise. Today, we're travelling forward from that date. What was important about 1868? Well, it's when the Edo period ended. The Tokugawa shogunate declined, and the emperor's power was re-established, at least in theory. And I say in theory because it was during this period that the Meiji Constitution limited the powers of the emperor. This time is known as the Meiji Restoration, a time of political, social, and economic change in Japan, generally acknowledged to be 1868 to 1912. We're going to bring the story a little bit up to date with some contemporary Senryu too, don't worry. But today I'm going to start with a little story, which tentatively links me with this restoration. And when I say tentatively, I'm really not kidding. Last week, I was over in London and popped in to visit my old university. That's University College in London. And while I was nostalgically wandering around its hallowed halls, I came across a very small poster hidden in a corner. It told a story about the Shoshun Five, a small group of Japanese noblemen who secretly left Japan to study at UCL in the mid-1860s, when that was rather a dangerous thing to do. Now, to cut a long story short, one of these fives, Ito Hirobumi, was a Japanese politician and statesman who returned to Japan after his studies and served as the first Prime Minister of Japan. He was a member of the group of senior statesmen that dictated Japanese policy during this Meiji era. So, ta-da! My connection. I wasn't fibbing when I said the link was tentative. There is a lovely monument to the connection between University College and Japan, which has a haiku on it. Unfortunately, it neither credits its creator nor translator, but I thought you might like to hear it. When distant minds come together, cherry trees blossom. When distant minds come together, cherry trees blossom. So now, let's head back to around 1868 and have a very brief and extremely superficial look at what was happening around the world. In the US, the Civil War was not long over, and Andrew Johnson was president of the US, a role he took on after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, for whom he was the vice president. And, you might be interested to know, he was the first US president to be impeached. I think it's fair to say that the history books have him down as not the best of presidents. In Britain, Queen Victoria is on the throne, and the first general election was held, enacting a reform bill which allowed more urban men to vote. women did not benefit despite having a female monarch. Typical, eh? Insufferable even for politicians. Women's suffrage. Insufferable even for politicians. Women's suffrage. And I'm afraid the author of that isn't known either. For the last 10 years, India has been under the direct rule of Great Britain. And of course, in Japan, we have the aforementioned Meiji Restoration taking place. This has a major impact from our point of view as short-form poets because it enables the Japanese literati to openly study Western literature. And I've spoken about this on numerous occasions on the podcast. It's well known that Western literature had an impact on the thinking of shiki, for example, and the development of haiku. But what of senryu? Well, I think I have mentioned that senryu is often characterized as a merely comic verse and has been looked down on through the ages. And if anything, the Meiji Restoration period, in which Western literature was more accessible and highly regarded, did very little to improve the reputation of these verses. So not a brilliant time for senryu, and not helped by all the rules and regulations governing it. However, some 10 years or so after the Restoration, a newspaper, Maru Maru Jinbun, started a column in which anyone could contribute a 17-syllable humorous verse that commented on a topic of the day. And that seems to have revitalized the art. And I have a few examples for you. Now remember, it had become difficult because of government restrictions to criticize the state or leading members of society. Well, after the Meiji Restoration, it was a little bit easier to do that. And this example is perhaps an illustration of that. Rustic samurai, mucking around now more in paddies than with poetry. Rustic samurai, mucking around now more in paddies than with poetry. Another unknown poet, translated by Adam Kern. But the Restoration Senryu can also give us an insight of that social and cultural change that was going on at the time. The next two poems encapsulate the idea that the Western world was seen as civilized, but in the tradition of Senryu, could they also be mocking their society, which has turned to the West? Tell me what you think. Even love letters by civilized young ladies in block style. Even love letters by civilized young ladies in block style. Civilized skies stretching out into writing gone sideways. Civilized skies stretching out into writing gone sideways. Again, both of these poets are unknown to us, but translated by Adam Kern. So in the early 1900s, two journalists, Sakai Kuraki and Inoue Kenkabo, are recognized as the major influences of Senryu development. Sakai Kukare, who had studied with Shiki, by the way, launched a Senryu reform under Shiki's influence. In 1903, whilst working for Nippon, he published Senryu Kogai, in which he promoted the free spirit of Senryu, just like the earlier editions of Yanogidaru. I have an example of his work for you. Socialism, nothing up and running except taverns. Socialism, nothing up and running except taverns. When he left Nippon, he was succeeded by Inoue Kenkabo, and he started a column called Shindai Yanagidaru, in which he encouraged writers to write on topics which characterized the emerging society. It was extremely popular. And as a result of its popularity, he started a magazine called Senryu in 1904. And, not wishing to lose out on the act, Sakai Kuraki also founded another Senryu journal the year after, Satsukioi. Although women have been writing Senryu, they were few in numbers, but around now we're beginning to see more writing. Sakai Kuraki's wife, Sakai Sobaijo, got in on the act. At every command he gives, the second lieutenant jumps up. At every command he gives, the second lieutenant jumps up. And again, not wishing to be left out, we have a poem from the wife of Inui Kenkabo, Inui Nobuko. No matter how I sit, I only see myself the way I am. No matter how I sit, I only see myself the way I am. Now, she was, like her husband, a pioneer in the Senryu world. And in 1929, she established the first association of women Senryu writers in Japan. Although, let's be clear, women's Senryu writing groups already existed. And of course, these developments led to more theories regarding the Senryu form. There were a couple of poets, Ichian and Kenkaibo, who said Senryu should be free verse. Others that said Senryu could be extended in the direction of symbolism and surrealism. Like this. In the sunset glow, a slaughterhouse. Cow, 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 cow. Cow, 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 cow. In the sunset glow, a slaughterhouse. Cow, 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 cow. Cow, 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 cow. By Kimura Hanmonson. Translated by Makoto Ueda. I plant a cactus in my eyes and give up. I plant a cactus in my eyes and give up. Mayura Ikkyo. After a heated argument, I go out to the street and become a motorcycle. After a heated argument, I go out to the street and become a motorcycle. Kaniko Touta. Again translated by Ueda. From the 1920s onwards, Senryu dealt with the results of the economic depression and often were used to promote the ideals of socialism and communism. Like this poem by Morita Katsuji, who was an employee of the National Railways. A labour strike. The chain is loosened by a few inches. A labour strike. The chain is loosened by a few inches. And then, of course, there were war poems. This next poem was written in 1937, when Japan was engaged in a war with China. The poet was arrested for this and other senryu he'd written, and he died in jail a few months later. No arms or legs. They turned the man into a log before sending him home. No arms or legs. They turned the man into a log before sending him home. Tsuru Akira. Then after Japan entered the Second World War in 1942, there were obviously severe restrictions on what could be written. And to be honest with you, I really didn't find anything in my search for World War II Japanese senryu until I found a book of work written by Japanese internees in America. The book was They Never Asked. And I have a couple of poems from that. Melancholy laughter, help us pass the time until the train departs. Melancholy laughter helps us pass the time until the train departs. Kenzuku from They Never Asked. And this one gave the title to the book. They never asked, suspicious or not, just put us away. They never asked, suspicious or not, just put us away. Senryu. And then digging a little bit deeper, I discovered that writing Senryu in these wartime internment camps was a common thing. I have a few more for you. Oh, incomprehensible. In a bachelor's room, woman's shoes. Oh, incomprehensible. In a bachelor's room, woman's shoes. Author unknown. And apparently, Senryu clubs were a thing in the internment camps, and they had competitions, much like we've spoken about in the previous podcast. And this one was banned from the competition because it was a little bit too risque, apparently. Wouldn't see that now, would you? Perfectly acceptable. Again, the fingerprints, the old man's bitter face. Again, the fingerprints, the old man's bitter face. Author unknown. Within the fence, one more fence, a roundabout way. Within the fence, one more fence, a roundabout way. Author unknown. Going back to Japan now. So when restrictions were lifted at the end of the war, leaders of these Senryu groups were more or less starting from scratch. The war had changed so much, and many were rejecting the ideas that had predated and existed during the war. The group leaders of the many new Senryu groups had to reflect the changes. And what characterized Senryu after World War II was, above all, a thematic and stylistic diversity that reflected the chaos of post-war society. Having said that, though, the Senryu written post-war was quite moderate and lacking in experimentation. For example, when corrupt politicians tried to escape charges by putting the blame on their secretary, that house of mine, my secretary built it without my knowledge. That house of mine, my secretary built it without my knowledge. Nakamura Bonzo, translated by Matthew Spellman. Now, having said that women were getting more involved, I'd like to highlight some women Senryu writers. Post-World War II, the number of women writing Senryu increased dramatically. Let's hear some of their work. And while I was reading it, I was wondering, do men and women write Senryu from different angles? Do they have a different take on life? I mean, yes, they probably do, but have a listen, have a watch. Tell me what you think. And maybe we'll explore that a little bit more next year. The whole thing, the whole of it slips in, I slip in. The whole thing, the whole of it slips in, I slip in. Heihachi Fujio, which reminds me very much of the McClintock poem that I promised I'd never mention again, but now I have to. Pushing inside until her teeth shine. Michael McClintock. Running down the giraffe's neck, the orgasm. Running down the giraffe's neck, the orgasm. Seino Shizato. Let me eat you, you eat me, to become nothingness. Let me eat you, you eat me, to become nothingness. Mayumi Akiko. And for our last poem, a single fish crosses the ice age. A single fish crosses the ice age. Onishi Yasuyu. For now, let me just sum up what we're going to be looking for during this submission period. Obviously, Senryu. And from what we've seen, Senryu are about human life in all its shapes and forms. No seasonal content needed. No cut is necessary. They can be humorous, but don't have to be. Make us laugh or make us cry. And Hino Sojo observed that Senryu are poems that make people nod in agreement, whereas haiku make people feel. Perhaps bear that in mind too. And you can, within those constrictions, of course, you can write about anything you want to. So, love, current affairs, but please remember, particularly as many of us are coming up to or have just had elections, overtly political poems won't be used. I'm not going there. Religion and state, but let's be respectful. I think if we're taking the mickey out of a state, then it should be the one you live in, not somebody else's. And religion's always a bit difficult, so be very careful with that one. Do expose the ridiculousness in society and your everyday life, maybe. And as we've seen, you can write Senryu about death. You can employ surrealism and symbolism if you want to, or just write in a contemporary freestyle. Surprises. Maybe experiment yourself. So, that's it for today. Do please support Poetry P with a membership. Benefits for you too, of course. Or buy us a coffee, which will help me keep this show on the road, if you can. There is a link to the essay that goes with this podcast in the show notes. They cost less than a coffee in a Swiss cafe, so purchasing the essay will also help with my stress levels about costs. Thank you very much. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for more original poetry. Come along and find out which poems were selected by our lovely editing team for the single object challenge I set you, and which of those were the judges' choices and honourable mentions. Can't wait to hear what you think. So until next time, keep writing. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share it with your haiku friends. And if you're feeling adventurous, do leave the episode a review. It truly will help more people find us. And there's something very exciting coming in the near future. But of course, as I always say, only people on the mailing list will find out about it. Ciao.